Well, welcome everyone to the first virtual hoof health workshop. I've done this workshop at the Dairy Nutrition Conference numerous times, and this is the first time we're trying it this way. So we'll see how it goes. I thought it would be kind of fun to try and do it live. I've got a bunch of cadaver specimens here that we can have a look at, and we'll use those to demonstrate some of the points that I'm trying to make. I'm Ernest Hovingh. I'm an extension veterinarian here at Penn State. I also do research and field investigations and teaching. And lameness is one of the areas that I've spent quite a bit of my career working on. It's an issue that's still going to be around for a long time. We haven't solved all the problems, but it's certainly one that is pretty important and I think we need to deal with. So my email address is there on the screen at the bottom. You should be able to see that, eph1@psu.edu. Please feel free to email me at any time. I won't be able to take them during the workshop here, but afterwards I'm more than happy to talk to you about lameness issues and other issues in dairy cattle. If you do have questions as we're going, please feel free to unmute yourself. You should have the ability to do that and ask a question, or you can type something in the chat pod. I've got another iPad set up here where I can monitor the chat, so hopefully I'll be able to catch those. You'll see that I'm going to switch between a bunch of different cameras as we're going here, so sometimes clicking on the speaker window will give you a view of one of the cameras. Right now I'm using my webcam so you can see me, but when we're looking at the cadaver specimens, we'll switch around a little bit. So you might have to switch between my presenter screen and between my little window where my name is in. You might want to have them open side by side. You can do that however you want to set it up. If you can't see something very well, please let me know and I'll try and improve what we're doing. So with that, let's get started because we have a lot to cover and a little bit less time than normal to cover it in. So what we're going to do is try and look at lameness from both the inside of the foot and the outside of the foot and try and figure out what's going on and how we can prevent lameness and try and deal with lameness if we have a lameness issue. So looking at a comprehensive hoof health program, we'd really like to look, first of all, at preventing lameness. That's the best way, obviously, to deal with lameness is try and prevent it in the first place. But if we cannot prevent it, and we can't prevent every incidence of lameness, we have to have a good way to identify cows that are lame. Or if we're just seeing a general trend and increase in lameness, we're really not going to spend any time talking about that today. But that's a very important part of an overall hoof health program for a herd. And then lastly, once we identify cows that are lame, we need to have a good way to manage those. If we don't manage them properly, things are going to get worse and in general, and that's not a good thing. And again, properly managing a lame cow before she develops a more severe lameness condition is going to be beneficial. Again, we won't talk very much about managing lameness. We'll talk a little bit about that, but not in great detail. So when we're looking at the lameness conditions, we need to think about, sorry, let me just get over here. Okay, we need to think about the different factors that are potentially of concern, and we can think of these in a couple of different ways. But one of the things we can look at is cow factors. So there's a number of things at the cow level that we want to consider, and those are listed here on the slide. So size and weight of the animal in general, the larger an animal, the more likely it is to become lame. And so a large Holstein cow is more likely to develop lameness than a small Jersey cow, for example. Body condition, we'll talk about that a little bit here in a few minutes. Hoof shape, that's another important thing that we're going to discuss. Genetics, we're really not going to touch on in any significant degree. There's not a lot you can do with genetics, but you can do a little bit to try and improve hoof health. But overall, it's a relatively minor impact that you're going to have. Nutrition is very important. But certainly not the be-all and the end-all. There's a lot of other factors that are considered, and then other diseases that can put a cow at risk of developing lameness. Okay. I'm just going to switch over here for a second. All right. Okay, so next thing is environmental and facility factors. And so there's a number of these. Again, we don't have time to get into these in any great detail, but we'll touch on a couple of these. So stall usage is very important, that we have good stall usage, that we make sure that stocking density is not negatively impacting hoof health. The floor design, we'll touch on that just a little bit. Foot baths, we really probably don't have time to get into that in any great detail, but I'm more than happy to take any questions if you have those. Bedding, hygiene, ventilation are all other important factors to consider as well. So then we have the people and the protocols. These obviously tie in with the housing and the environmental factors and the cow factors, but people play a really important role in lameness as well and hoof health in the herd. And so handling, I think we'll have enough time to touch on that a little bit. Early identification and managing those cases properly, as I already discussed. Nutritional management, so we can have a great ration on paper, but if it's not being fed properly, that can certainly be a concern. Same with a foot bath, we can have an excellent foot bath protocol, but if it's not followed properly, that doesn't mean a whole lot. And the same for bedding. So these can all impact the amount, whether an individual cow becomes lame, and then also the level of lameness within a herd. Okay, but if we're going to talk about lameness and preventing lameness especially, and even treating lameness, we need to know where lameness occurs. And in cattle, almost all the lameness in cattle occurs in the feet itself. And if you look at the distribution of lameness in the feet, it's not evenly distributed amongst all the feet. The hind feet are more susceptible to becoming lame. And within the hind feet, the outer claws are definitely at higher risk. So it's not something that we see equally distributed amongst all the claws on all the feet, which says that something like nutrition, where we're feeding the whole cow, obviously cannot be the only factor, because if it was, then we would expect to see even distribution of lameness conditions amongst all the claws in all the feet. So I'm not saying lameness is not important, but it's not certainly the only factor when we're talking about lameness by any stretch of the imagination. So we're going to spend a bit of time looking at why lameness develops potentially from the inside. And so what are some of the physiological factors that are important in determining how healthy a hoof is. And then we're also going to look at the outside and see what some of the external factors are. And hopefully that'll become more clear as we're going here that can affect hoof health. And really it's the integration of these two which determines whether or not, or the intersection of these two, whether or not a cow becomes lame. So just a quick analogy here, if you will. If you're thinking of building a new building, right, and we want that building to last for a long time, we need to consider a number of things when we're designing the building. And so we need to think about whether we draw it on a paper napkin or whether we actually get an engineer to design it. A well-engineered and well-designed building is probably going to stand longer than a building that is not properly designed or engineered. That's certainly an issue. Once we have a good design, we still need to make sure we have good quality of materials and enough materials to make the building. So if we don't follow the blueprints, or if we say, well, we're going to skip every other truss in the building because that's a lot cheaper, that certainly does not bode well for that structure being able to withstand external forces and last for a long time. Then we might have good quality materials, we might have enough materials, and we might have a well-engineered building. But if we have workers who have no idea how to read blueprints, that can be a problem. And so if the workers that are actually doing the work to build the building don't know what they're doing, or if they show up at work hungover or sick, or they don't take water breaks and they don't take lunch breaks, that can certainly affect the quality of their work as well. So really all of these things have to work together to design a good quality building that's going to stand for a long time. And that's the same with our feet. We need to have it well engineered. We have to have good materials to build that foot. And then we need to have proper cells that are able to do their job and put all of those things together. So then we can say, okay, we've got this building design. Now, what are the external forces acting on it? And it could be wind forces, right? So we want to develop or design our buildings and build them to withstand these types of external conditions, such as wind. We want to think about water. We want to think about pests. And we want to think about things like snow load, if that's of concern in the area where the building's being built. So these are the external factors that are affecting the building, right? And going to determine whether or not it stands. And really, it's those two things together, both the internal factors, how it was built, and the external factors that are going to determine whether or not it stands. So when we have a building like this barn that collapsed in Lancaster County, I believe it was a number of years ago, is it because the snow load was just extraordinarily heavy? Or was it because the building wasn't designed properly or it wasn't built properly? I'm not sure what the answer was, but it could be either of those factors. Right? And so it's the same with feet. Why does a cow become lame? Is it because her foot was not healthy from the inside? Is it because she just had so many external factors that were overloading that foot, so to speak, that she became lame? Or was it some combination of the two? And so I would argue the first thing we need to do is make sure that we have a really healthy foot that can withstand as many external factors or external impacts as possible. All right, so if we then think about how all these factors really fit together, it's very seldom that I can go into a herd and find that it's just the nutrition that's causing the problem, that it's just infectious claw diseases that are causing the problem. Usually it's some combination of a number of different factors that are going to determine how healthy the hooves are in a herd. And so that's kind of an interesting puzzle to try and solve, but it also means that very seldom can we go in and say, okay, well, if you just fix this one single thing, you're going to have everything taken care of. All right, so what are some of the internal factors then in how this foot is built that are going to affect the quality and health of the hoof tissue? Well, I already mentioned genetics plays a bit of a role here, but we're not going to discuss that in any more detail today. But what I do want to focus on is this idea of laminitis. As we're going through this, I hope you'll see that choritis is a better term, and I'll explain that as we're going. But related to that is the loss of cushioning and excessive pressure on the corium. And again, hopefully these will become clear as we kind of work through this. Okay, so just to touch on the anatomy of the foot a little bit here. As you can see, this is a cross-section of the foot here, and this P3 bone is the last bone in the foot. And that's the third phalanx, and you can see that we don't have a flat bottom to this digit usually. It's kind of concavely shaped like this. From the bottom, this is approximately what it looks like in this area here. This is the approximate location of it. And this black dashed line along here is actually the white line. And that's where the sole, which is right here, joins the hoof wall, which is right here. So the white line is very important because it holds these two together. It also happens to be the weakest part of the foot because it allows for a little bit of hinging there, or a little bit of movement between the sole and the hoof wall. So the white line, as you'll see as we're going through here, is a very important structure in the foot as well. Okay, just to look at the P3 bone and the claw capsule. So the claw capsule is everything that you see, that's right here. And that's what you would see if you would rip the claw capsule off of a foot. And then the P3 bone, there's some soft tissue in between here. Obviously, you can see here that there's a potential space here, or there is a space here because that's filled with soft tissue. Part of that is the corium, which is the most important part of that, but there's other very important structures in between this P3 bone and the claw capsule. Once again, you'll note the shape of P3 here, that it's kind of concave. Not every P3 bone is shaped exactly like this, but there tends to be a concave shape to that. And right here is where the flexor tendon, deep digital flexor tendon, attaches. And this is close to the back of the claw, right about here. Okay, so let's spend just a couple of minutes then talking about laminitis and what the lamina is and what the corium is and why it really matters. We'll look at that in the next few slides here. Okay, so the corium is the tissue that's between the P3, or it's part of the tissue that's between P3 and the claw capsule. And the corium is the tissue that is responsible for making all of the claw capsule. So everything that you see on the outside of that foot is produced by the claw capsule, including the hoof wall, the white line, the sole, the heel, and the coronary band. And so the corium is the tissue, all of that tissue that produces that. But even looking at this picture here, if all of this is a dead animal, but you can see there's still a lot of blood pooled in this area because it's a very vascular tissue. So you can see just by looking at it that there's different areas of the corium here. So this looks visually different than this, and that's because they have a different role to play. And so if we look at those areas, then this is where the hoof wall is formed. So this smooth area right here is where the hoof wall is formed. So that's akin to where your fingernail would be produced. And it's formed up here, and then there's no more added to the hoof wall once you're at about this level of the claw capsule. And I'll show you that in more detail here in a minute. The coronary band, which is similar to the cuticle, is formed up here, and the heel is also formed by this corium. The white line is actually produced by this part of the corium, which is called the laminar corium. So this is the laminar corium. And that's also a very important tissue, which we'll talk about. And this is where the lamina, the name lamina and laminitis actually comes from, is thinking just about this part of the corium. And then obviously there's corium on the sole of the foot or on the bottom of the foot as well. Okay, so here's a cross section, and again, I'll show you some live here in a few minutes, but just to demonstrate a couple of things. First of all, we said that perioplic corium is way up here, which forms the coronary band up here, and then forms the hoof wall right here. So you can see very nicely how this hoof wall is differentiated from the sole right here. Okay, so this is the perioplic corium, part of the corium that makes that. And then the hoof wall, you'll notice how right here it's very thin or non-existent, and then it gets thicker and thicker and thicker, and right approximately here it reaches its maximum thickness. So this is the coronary corium where the hoof wall is formed, and it keeps adding more tissue to the hoof wall until right about here, and then it's done. So this is as thick as the hoof wall is going to get. And now what happens is that as it slides down this way, as it continues to grow, the laminar corium, which is right here, holds this hoof wall right here to this P3 bone, which is outlined right here. Okay? So this laminar corium right here at this point is holding this P3 bone and this hoof wall together, and that's its job, is to do that. And then you'll see as it grows down, this is still the laminar corium, and then here it really stops. It's not vascular anymore, there's no blood supply, but this becomes the white line. So this is the white line right here. And the white line is really just a continuation of this tissue as it grows down. And this is where the sole is now joined with the hoof wall. Okay, so the white line is right here and joins the sole and the hoof wall. And then we have this tissue right here, which is the solar corium down on the bottom. And that's kind of that purplish tissue right along the very bottom there. And it's producing this sole tissue that you see right here. Okay, so that's its job, is just to continue to produce new sole tissue. It goes down this way and then it wears off at this surface here. So we'll have a closer look at this, but this is the important parts of the corium of the foot. Okay, just a quick look at a little bit closer look at the lamina. You'll see that if you kind of imagine here, there's folds or leaves of the insensitive lamina, and here of the sensitive lamina, and those really interdigitate like this, right? So they're layered together like this. And for those of you who are a little bit older and remember at the time back when we had phone books that were made from paper, you could actually put phone books together by putting the individual leaves together like this. And it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to pull those apart because of the tremendous amount of surface area that's holding those two together. So that's true for the lamina as well. But if that tissue breaks down so that there's not that tight connection anymore, then the hoof wall can start separating from the P3 bone. And I'll show you an example of that here in just a moment. Okay, so here's a closer look. I didn't bring my scanning electron microscope into the lab here. I don't have one either, but this is a picture of what it would look like under high magnification. And you can see these layers of the sensitive lamina and insensitive lamina that are leaved together like that. Okay, so laminitis then is when we have inflammation, like the itis of the lamina, but that would imply only this area here. But really we can get inflammation or irritation and injury in any part of the corium. So it can happen up here, it can happen on the sole, it can happen anywhere. And so really a better term is choritis. I don't want to split hairs too much, but again, choritis is technically a better term because laminitis just refers to this area right here. So as you'll see in a few seconds here, we can have inflammation, we can have injury and damage to any part of the corium, which is going to impact what it can do. So again, choritis is technically a better term. We often use them interchangeably, but again, to be technically correct, choritis is the better term. Okay, so what happens then? So we have injury in the corium, or we have choritis happening, and that can be from any number of things. We're going to focus on a couple of those today, specifically mechanical injury and excessive pressure, but acidosis, so rumen acidosis, subacute ruminal acidosis can be part of that. Toxic mastitis can be part of this. For some reason, we get a disruption of the normal blood flow. We get some injury to the corium, and that means that we have a change in the blood flow in a part of the corium or maybe a fairly large area of the corium. So when that happens, that's similar to having the employees who are building your barn or the contractors who are building your barn not having enough food, not having enough water, working out in the hot sun. They can't really do their job well because they're not getting the nutrients that they need. And same with the cells in the corium, they're not getting what they need to be able to do their job. And so the corium stops producing the claw tissue, or maybe it still produces some, but it doesn't do a very good job, right? So either one of those could be the case. And again, this could be the sole, it could be the white line, the hoof wall, the heel, or the coronary band, any of those. And again, we'll look at those here in 2 seconds. Okay, so rumen acidosis, the idea here is that we get a disruption in the circulatory system, especially in the periphery, so in the feet, that'll happen. And there's vasoactive substances that are absorbed through the rumen wall, and they can affect the circulation in the foot. That's a negative impact, obviously. Nutrition can also play an important role in terms of producing good quality hoof tissue, right? So if we buy better quality wood for our barn, we can hopefully build a better barn. And the same idea is if we provide some supplements and additives, we might actually produce a better quality hoof that can withstand a little bit more of these external forces. Now, having said that, we do need to make sure there's research to support that additive or that supplement as being effective in improving hoof health. And again, so we need to ask for some research before we're going to spend a lot of money on that. And nutrition is not going to solve every single hoof health problem out there by any means. Just adding a supplement or an additive is not going to fix all the problems. One of the things, and we're not going to touch on this too much more than these next couple of slides, but we shouldn't forget about the young stock. We need a good quality ration for them, and so we need to consider, if we're feeding byproducts or waste feed or feed refusals, what could it potentially do to them. Here's a young calf with a sole ulcer. So we have a hole all the way through the sole, and we're seeing the corium right here. This is another herd that I was in, and again, we had heifers that didn't have very good looking feet underneath them, and that becomes a concern because there is evidence that we can affect the quality of the feet by the nutrition of heifers. And this was one study that was done, published a number of years ago, and their conclusions were that their work supported earlier work that feeding a wet diet to dairy young stock could negatively impact the claw health before and after calving, right? And so that's certainly not a good thing if those first calf heifers come into the herd lame or develop lameness shortly afterwards. And they also suggest that if you have poor claw health in those heifers before they freshen, that we can have problems in a subsequent lactation. So even if you fix that ulcer in that calf, that might come back to haunt you later when she freshens and is at greater risk of developing lameness. So this was that herd that I showed you. Let me just go back here. This herd right here on the right, this was what those girls were eating. I would argue it's a cheap ration, yes. It may not be the highest quality ration for these girls, and is something you might want to consider the impact of that on the health, the hoof health of these animals. So yes, it's a variety of food, and it's probably cheap, but it may not be the best for the hoof health of these girls. All right, so why does it matter? Well, it matters because if we make lousy quality feet, right, whether it's lousy quality hoof wall, lousy quality soles, lousy quality white line, they're more susceptible to mechanical damage, more susceptible to injury. So even here, we can make the argument that if we have lousy quality heel tissue, we're more likely to get heel erosions and possibly even digital dermatitis or hairy heel warts or strawberries or whatever you want to call them. So the idea is, again, we want to produce as high a quality hoof tissue as we can. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples. Here's one I'll just show you. This is a cross section, and what we see here is that we have the, again, the hoof wall being formed up here. It reaches its maximum thickness right about here. So the laminar corium starts right here. The lamina starts right here. And then this, you'll see, is pretty well parallel to the P3 bone. And you can see something happened here, and something probably happened right here, which is causing problems in that corium. So here we've got a bruise essentially in the corium, right? And here this happened a little while ago because this is no longer vascular. So this happened back when the tissue was up here. And so we've got another bruise here and damaged corium. And so this is a defect now in the white line. You wouldn't see this when you were initially trimming this because you wouldn't want to go that deep. But as this grows down, we now have a defect in the white line, and it's much easier for an infection to get up in here and travel inside this space right here in the lamina here. And then eventually that infection will break out up here at the coronary band. So that's what you see in this picture here is an infection that's breaking out at the coronary band. Well, the chances are 99.99% that that infection actually entered the white line down here. Didn't have anywhere to grow or escape, if you will, but it grew the infection grew all the way up into here, and then finally was able to break out the soft tissue at the coronary band. All right, so we're going to stop with this for a second, and what we're going to do now is switch over to our other cameras here. So I've got two cameras set up here, and we're going to use both of these. All right. So we're going to look at a few samples here of feet. And these are ones that we got from the slaughter plant a few days ago. All right, so what we've got here is a dirty but fairly normal looking foot, okay? You can see on the bottom here, if you will, there's the white line. And so this is the white line right here. Okay, so this is the hoof wall, this is the white line, and this is the sole. All right. So you can see that this white line, actually, you can see those layers of tissue there, if you will, the sensitive and insensitive lamina. Now they're the white line, they're no longer the sensitive and insensitive lamina, but they're actually separated a little bit further than we would normally see. So if we look at the other side of this claw, we can see a somewhat similar type appearance right here. Okay. Again, some separation of that white line. So it's going to be more susceptible to getting an infection in there.
Dr. Hovingh?
Yes.
For whatever reason, I'm seeing your staples. Yeah, I'm not seeing what you're pointing at.
That might have been on, that was on my presenter cam, so you might not have seen it. You might not have been looking at that one. I'll switch over to the other one. So you might have to click on the, all right, are you seeing that one better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can use either camera, either my presenter cam or this one, but let me see if I can zoom in here a little bit. Yeah. All right, let's try this one then. So let's go through this again. So again, a fairly normal looking foot just came from the slaughter plant. And again, we'll talk about the length of the toes and so on here. The hoof walls look fairly normal in this specimen. But if we look at the bottom here, we obviously have the soles right here. So this is the sole. This is the hoof wall right on the outside. And this is the white line. And that white line is a little bit wider than we would like to see it. You can also maybe appreciate that there's actually layers there, which were the lamina at one point, and now the white line. But those are those leaves that I was talking about that interleaf together of the sensitive and insensitive lamina. So again, this white line is probably susceptible to some infection getting in there and then traveling up the white line. So, all right, so the same thing, if we look on the other claw here, you can see the white line is actually a little bit narrower than the other side, but you can still appreciate maybe a little bit of the layers of the lamina in there. So, all right, so the heels look pretty healthy on this one. So you can see the heels look pretty healthy right here and right here. And again, that's a good thing. But there is some evidence that maybe we have some white line problems in this claw. Okay, if we look at one that's cut open now, you can see here that this is the P3 bone right here. Okay, you can see the flexor tendon attached right here to the P3 bone, and this is the corium right here. Okay, and you can see that at one point down here, there's a little bit of hemorrhage in this sole. So that's grown out now. That happened a month or 6 weeks ago back here where the corium was. This is like getting a bruise in your underneath your fingernail. And it's grown down now, and it's probably of no consequence anymore to this cow. But let's see if this works. Often this is softer tissue, and we can actually push this in there fairly easily. Okay, so that's not normal. You shouldn't be able to do that in a normal sole. The other part of the sole, I can't really push the probe in there. but right here, it's actually kind of soft because that's abnormal tissue. And so you can see how that's more susceptible now to damage. So this was an event that happened 6 weeks ago. I don't know if she calved 6 weeks ago. I'm not sure what happened to her, but something happened to her 6 or so weeks ago. And if there had been multiple layers of this, now we would be at risk of it developing a hole or a sole ulcer all the way through the bottom of this claw. If we look at the other claw, so we don't see the same thing happening here. Okay, so this is pretty normal looking sole all the way across the bottom here. And you can see that you don't see a corresponding defect here in the sole. And that, again, is because there's other factors involved, right? It's not just nutrition. It's not just the fact that she calved, but there was probably excessive weight on the other claw compared to this one. And so we didn't have the same problems that we did in the other claw. All right. So one of the things that we'll touch on in a few minutes in the PowerPoint if we have time, but one of the protective factors is a series of fat pads that are actually like gel inserts in your shoes. And so if we look at this one, again, we're going to see the hoof wall right here. We see that it's pretty much parallel to this P3 bone right here. And then underneath or between this P3 bone and the corium, which is right down against the sole, you can actually see these fat pads. Let me get it in focus here for you. You can see these fat pads right here. And these fat pads are kind of like the gel inserts in your shoes that provide some shock absorber effect and try and protect that corium from having excessive pressure from this P3 bone on it. So that's what those fat pads are doing. And you can kind of see, turn a little bit here, you can see how they squish. Obviously, when that was connected, they would provide some shock absorber effect in the bottom of the foot. So as cows lose body condition, those fat pads get thinner. There's probably some other hormonal factors as well that are part of that. But in some cases, these fat pads will be very thin, and then we don't have that protective effect to try and protect the corium from the pressure of the P3 bone there. So. Okay, so we had mentioned that having the white line hold together is pretty important, and having those lamina hold together is pretty important. So what I'm going to show you here is a claw where that's not happening. Okay, so this is a claw with chronic laminitis, true laminitis. Okay, and so as you can see, we actually have a very long toe here. Okay? The other thing to note is that it's very wide. So if you look at it, you'll see that that hoof wall is splaying out to the side. Okay, so let's look at that by looking at a couple of sections here. And so here's what's going on here is that you'll see this white line is very wide in this foot. Okay, and so we're getting some separation here. We're getting chronic laminitis. So the lamina up here is not holding together well the way that it should. And as a consequence, this digit or this hoof wall is starting to splay out to the side. So as I showed you previously, this hoof wall should be coming down parallel to the P3 bone, which is right here. It should be parallel, but in this case, it's pulling all the way out to the side like this because we have chronic laminitis, true laminitis in this case, causing this white line to be very wide. So you can't fix this. Once this has happened, it's going to remain that way. You can try and trim it so that it looks half decent, but that's a chronic laminitis condition and it won't resolve itself. Okay, here's another claw. And in this case, what we see, again, that nice parallel hoof wall to the P3 bone, but this is the outside claw of the hind foot. Okay, and I'll explain later why that is, but you can see it has a thicker sole than it does on the inside claw. And what you see here is a very nice evidence of some laminitis at some point, or choritis again is a better term, in the solar corium right here. But this happened 4 weeks ago or so. Okay, so it's the same, similar to the image I showed, or the claw I showed you earlier, in that we have a defect in the sole there right now. And this is a typical sole ulcer location. And again, I expect that I can push this in here fairly easily. See how easily I can push that into the that spot right there. Whereas the rest of the sole it's very difficult to get in. I can get in if I push really hard, but you can see I don't make a defect in there. But here, it's pretty easy to make a defect in there. So it's easy to understand now why, if we have especially multiple episodes or a severe case of choritis here in the solar corium, that we can end up with significant damage to that sole, and that can have negative consequences for the cow. Again, you will see fat pads there, so there is a fat pad. Maybe you can see kind of swishing out there. Okay, so one of the other things that can happen is that, and I've tried to screw these back together so we can have a look at the outside of the foot first, but fairly normal looking claws, if you will. Okay, a little bit of white line, evidence of white line separation there. But if we look at this and take this apart for a minute, you'll see how you couldn't see this from the outside. You probably would have seen it if you were trimming, but what we've got here is a significant defect in the sole. This is not just over the back of P3, but it's really across the whole of the bottom of the sole. Okay, and again, you don't see that from the bottom when you're looking just at the bottom of the claw because it's so deep in there. Again, I expect that I should be able to get my probe in there pretty easily, right? So that's going to be a potential space now where we can get an abscess. So if we get an infection in this space, now we can have an abscess that forms on the bottom of this claw. If we have a completely healthy claw, it's very difficult to get an abscess in there because the tissue is just so strong or there's no defect in it, so it's hard for an abscess to spread. But if you have a situation like this, it's pretty easy to get an abscess in there because we have that space. We'll just have a look at the other side here of the claw for a minute. And if we look at the opposite claw, in this case, we actually see that there's also problems here in the opposite claw. Again, not in exactly the same location, but in this case, we're actually back further, closer to the back of P3. And you can see that we have a defect right there in the typical sole ulcer spot. This suggests that something happened more recently than on the other side, because on this side, it's grown, we've grown some new tissue already. But on this side of the foot, this has happened more recently. So this has probably happened within the last week or so. And I'm not sure, it looks like we might have some new sole tissue forming right here. But again, this is in the typical sole ulcer spot where we now have a defect in the bottom of that foot. Right? So again, you would not see this from the bottom of the foot. She probably was lame because this would have been painful. This is like hitting your thumb with a hammer or your fingernail with a hammer. That would definitely be painful, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to see it on the bottom of this foot. Okay, let's see how much time we have left here. Okay, just quickly, I want to show you this one then. So we have some time to finish up here. But so this claw, this foot has a block on it, as you can see. Okay, so somebody put a block on this claw, and usually one of the big reasons for doing that is because we have a sole ulcer or a full thickness defect in the opposite claw. So that would be right here. So let's have a look at that. You can see here, just by looking at the bottom, that it appears there's a defect all the way through to the bottom of the sole and into the corium here. So we'll take that apart and have a look for a minute. So you can see on this one, some of this has been trimmed out. As you can see right here, there's some trimming has been done. But this is the corium, and so the corium is actually exposed to the outside world, and so this is a sole ulcer, and that's why the block was placed on the opposite claw. So it looks like they did a pretty good job actually cleaning this one out. I'm pretty happy to see the way they did that there. And again, we don't have time to get into all the details, but you need to remove all of the loose tissue here without damaging the corium excessively, and it looks as if they've accomplished that. But what's interesting is if we take the other side apart and have a look at the side with the block on it. Okay, so this is the claw with a block on it. And a couple of things you'll observe here. One, we have a defect in the sole right here. Okay, so there's a space there. We've got some healthy tissue above it again, but not a whole lot. So this again is going to be a defect in the sole. You can see how nicely that opens up when I stick this in there. But the other thing to note is that we have a defect back here at the typical sole ulcer site. And so this is quite likely come about because we have excessive pressure on this claw because we've taken the weight off of the other claw. So while the ulcer is healing fairly well, this girl might actually be lame now because she has damage to the corium here. And so that's one of the things we have to watch with blocks, is that if we put a block on, that we don't cause more damage to the corium on this claw. Again, I think blocks are a great thing to use, but we need to be careful that we don't leave them on longer than necessary, and we really want this claw to be as healthy as possible before we put a block on it. So, all right. So let's switch back for just a minute. Don't have any other questions here yet. All right. So we've got a few minutes left. What I'd like to do is switch back to PowerPoint here. And I'm just going to zip through these in the interest of getting to the last few things here. These are pictures of what you've seen. So what you're seeing here then is, and I didn't have an example of this, but if we have a sole ulcer, one of the consequences can be that we end up with an infection into the joint space here. So that's a very severe condition. It takes a long time to develop. It doesn't happen overnight. And once it happens, it's pretty difficult to treat successfully. You really can't get antibiotics in there very well, and we end up with a lot of problems in a very lame cow. So we really want to try and avoid septic arthritis. And if we do see a case with septic arthritis, we need to deal with that absolutely immediately. Okay, so we talked a little bit about pressure on the corium. Let's just see what we didn't cover here yet. But these are the things that can contribute to excessive pressure on the corium, including hoof shape and trimming, cow weight, housing, flooring, and handling. So when a cow normally puts her foot down just when she's walking, she normally hits the lateral claw or the outside claw of the left hind limbs, of the hind limbs first, as shown by this research here. So normally we get more pressure on there because that's the first part of the foot that strikes the walking surface. All right, so that's one of the other factors, right? So again, we talked about nutrition, we talked about fat pads, things like that. But this normally way they walk is to have that outside claw hit the walking surface first. We talked about the fat pads. Here's just a schematic or a drawing of that, showing what it looks like when they're healthy or when there's lots of it there. And then when they disappear, we lose that and we have much closer contact of the P3 bone with the corium, so more direct pressure, if you will. We don't spread that pressure out. All right, so there's a fat pad, picture of a nice fat pad. Okay, so again, we talked about this a little bit already, that we can affect the blood flow by putting pressure on, right? So you know that if you bite on your fingernail, you'll see that the blood disappears from your corium, if you will, or underneath your fingernail. If you slam your finger in a door, that's very short-term pressure, but it's very severe pressure, and that causes a change in the blood flow. And this can happen in a very small space, like I showed you in some of those feet, versus a larger space. It can also happen there. So these are some of the things we have to think about. And again, we don't have nearly enough time to go through all of these, but these are some of the things we need to think about when we're thinking about the external factors now. Okay, so that cow, we really want her to take the pressure off the corium by lying down in her stall enough hours per day. So this is what we'd like to see, that she doesn't have any pressure on the corium this way. And that's what we're trying to achieve. So we want them 12 to 14 hours of time, of hours per day resting is what we'd like to see. And so what we can do to accomplish that is to try and make sure our stocking density is not negatively impacting that, try and make sure that we're not keeping them away from the stalls, and then make sure that we have those stalls as absolutely comfortable as possible so that they want to get in them, they can lie down, they can rest comfortably, and then get up and get out of them again. So again, there's lots of stuff here that we don't have time to unpack, but you kind of understand how cow comfort becomes a very important part of hoof health. So another thing to think about is how the foot and the floor interact when she is walking, because obviously she is going to be up on her feet many hours a day. And so we need to think about all these different things. And one, even when she's just standing there without moving, there's an interaction between the floor and the foot. And so if you think about it, the pressure that the cow exerts on the walking surface is not even across the bottom of the foot, just because of the way the leg is designed. So there's more here normally at the back, just when she's standing. And then that can be negatively impacted by having long toes, which is going to shift more of the weight to the back. We can have things between the foot and the floor. We obviously groove our floors in most situations to try and improve the traction, but it doesn't help in terms of decreasing the pressure on the corium. All right, so a really quick calculation is done by Dan McFarland, who's an ag engineer here at Penn State. If we assume we can get that foot completely flat and she's walking, so she has one front foot and one hind foot up in the air, then she's probably exerting about 90 pounds per square inch on her feet. Realistically, it's very difficult to get a completely flat surface, which I'll show you in just a second. So if she's bearing on only 60% of the bottom of her foot, which might still be optimistic, she's probably got close to 150 pounds per square inch on her corium. So just so you can relate to that, if your thumbnail is about 1/3 of a square inch in area, then you'd stack two 30-pound concrete blocks approximately on your thumbnail and put that on a concrete surface, and then put the blocks on top of there, you would have approximately this 150 pounds per square inch. So you can appreciate there's a lot of pressure on that corium. Now, again, cows were designed for that, but if we start exceeding that significantly, we see the possibility to run into problems. And so this was a study that they had done where they tried to trim those feet as absolutely flat as possible. They put the cow on in a stall, and then they put a flat pressure plate underneath her and made her stand on there. So this was kind of an ideal situation where the pressure plate was as flat as possible. The feet they tried to trim them as flat as possible. They had her standing still and evenly bearing weight on all four limbs. And you can see even when they did that, they were not able to get even weight bearing across the bottom of these feet. And this area right here in red is 5 times the pressure of these light blue areas. So you can see that 150 pounds per square inch is now probably up closer to 300 pounds per square inch or even more. And this is very typical at the outside back of the outside claws, the lateral aspect of the hind limbs. That's typically what you're going to see is a lot of pressure there. And so it's not a wonder that we see a lot of white line lesions here, and we see sole ulcers right here. And then you take that foot and you don't put it on a flat pressure plate, but you put it on a walking surface that looks like this. You can now appreciate that and this was not, this picture just superimposed, obviously, but we're going to have tremendously greater pressure in the back of these feet because there's no weight bearing area here, there's no weight bearing area here, there's no weight bearing area here, and so on. So again, all these factors become extremely important and interact with each other. So it's not surprising then that it's not difficult to find evidence of trauma or injury of the solar corium in these feet. And that could just be walking around on a concrete tie stall or freestall barn. Could be if their cows are going outside and picking up stones, but if they don't have to, they can certainly get this type of damage just from excessive pressure and uneven weight-bearing surfaces. All right, then we have, to make things worse, we can have a dynamic interaction. And so if this cow puts her foot down and then moves it across the surface, we're actually going to have another impact there potentially. And so that can be a linear one, so she just slides. And if we're moving our cows too fast, if they're running, if they're being forced to move quickly, they're going to slide on that surface, especially if they don't have good traction. But even worse would be if we have a rotational force on that foot. So that cow puts her foot down and then turns it with weight on there. That's even worse. So the problem is that the hoof wall, which is the hardest tissue in this claw, wraps around the side and the front of this foot, but doesn't do very well at protecting the sole back here, which is the softest tissue in the foot here. And so it's not hard to imagine then that we get excessive, and there's more weight back here. So it's not hard to imagine then that we get excessive wearing on the sole, whereas the toe tends to grow longer. So this is typically what you'll see, not always, but typically that the toe ends up being fairly long, but the sole back here ends up being pretty thin. So even with a nice fat pad here, we can still have excessive wearing of this sole right back here. And now, as I said, it can get worse if we rotate that. So if we have that cow and she has pressure on that foot and she rotates it, that's going to be not a very good thing either. So, sorry, I lost my other computer here with the chat. So, okay. All right, so we don't want that to happen, okay? because then we can get things like this. So if we put weight on this foot and then we rotate it, you can see how this could pinch the corium here and end up having caused this bruise. All right, I think hopefully this will show up for you. Some video here. We have a couple of minutes to show these yet. But this cow is walking. This is a return lane for her crossover, coming back from the parlor, and she's making a 90-degree turn, getting into her pen. And you'll see the point of the hock here and the plane through the lower limb here. She moves her limb, but she doesn't rotate at all. Okay, so if we watch her walking in here, and we'll just grab her right here. You can watch, first of all, how she puts that foot, the hind foot, in exactly the same location where the front foot was. So that's a good thing. So she's tracking properly. But then if you watch here now, she puts that foot down and she doesn't move it relative to the weight-bearing surface. She rolls through the step, but she does not move that foot at all. Okay, so even though she's making a 90-degree turn into the pen, she doesn't move that foot at all relative to the walking surface. So there's not going to be any rotational stresses on that foot, and she didn't slide it at all, so no linear stresses either. But this cow here, she's making a 180-degree turn to get out of the parlor, and so let's watch her here. Now what she does right here, she's going to plant that left hind limb, okay, and then she's going to lift up her left forelimb and her rear right hind limb, and then she pivots about 90 degrees. Just watch that right here. So she pivots while she has weight on that foot, about 90 degrees. And so again, that's going to cause a tremendous amount of rotational stress in that foot, which is not a good thing. And you can find the same thing with a cow that's leaving the stall. Let me just show you really quickly here. This black cow, she's backing out, and she has weight on this foot now. She's going to rotate her body, but she really doesn't rotate the foot relative to the walking surface until she starts to pick it up. And that's a good thing. But if you have somebody moving this cow who doesn't know to take their time, you can understand that they're going to pivot on that foot and potentially cause lameness problems that way. All right, so again, the point of that all is that the techniques that we use to move animals can have a significant impact on the quality of that foot or the health of that foot. And so we really need to make the people who are getting the cows up to the holding pen or bringing them back from the return alleys, that they understand how important their job is and that they do that carefully and let the cows move at their own speed without forcing them to cause those problems. All right. So trimming is also important, and we only have a couple of minutes left here. I don't know if I'll get to showing you the trimming, maybe we will. Normally what you see in a cow in a freestall barn is that this would be the right rear foot. We're looking down the back of the foot, and you'll see that the outside claw ends up being thicker, or there ends up being more sole there than on the inside claw. And there's a number of reasons for this. One of them is it's similar to a callus, if you will, on your hands. So because that outside claw is hitting the walking surface first, there's going to be some reactive growth there. And so we end up with higher heels on the outside claw of the hind feet the vast majority of the time. That also means that she's walking a little bit like this, okay? So those are splayed out like this, and that's going to cause excessive pressure here again across the back of P3 in general, but especially over the sole ulcer site. So with our trimming, what we want to do then is try and achieve what you see in the lower picture here, is that we bring those claws back in balance to return them to a state where we have equal pressure across the corium as much as possible. Even though I showed you earlier, it's not possible to completely achieve that. In terms of the length, as I said earlier, we tend to have overgrown toes, and we tend to have heels that are excessively worn, especially on the inside claw of the hind feet. And so what we're trying to achieve with our trimming technique in this case is that we want to shorten the toes, but especially in the case of a thinner heel, we want to try and make sure that we don't thin the heel any further. All right, so I'm going to try and show that here in the last couple of minutes. We'll use this technique, which is called the Dutch hoof trimming method. And what we do is we measure 3 1/4 inches from the toe, and then we're going to make a straight cut here on the toe. So we want that 90 degrees to the bottom of the foot. And we want this to end up being a 1/4 inch thick approximately. And then in most cases, we're not going to take anything off the heel here of the shallower claw, which again, I'll show you in a second. And then that's what we're trying to accomplish. All right, so we're going to try and maximize our weight bearing area and not make that sole too thin. Okay, So let me just try and demonstrate that here for a second. We'll switch this over to here. So again, you can click on either my speaker window and maximize the speaker window, or what I'll do is I will share using the other camera. And sorry, I'm going to bounce around here a little bit. Okay, so I will try and show you here what we're trying to accomplish. So we're going to do a little bit of trimming right here. And again, you might be able to use my either one of these cameras to have a look at what I'm doing. Okay, so in this foot here, you can maybe appreciate that this claw right here, okay, is higher than this one right here. Again, I've cut them open and screwed them together, so it's not quite as obvious. But if we hold this straight across here, you'll see that I'm making contact with this heel on the outside, but I'm not making contact with this heel. So this heel is usually as shallow as we want it, so we don't want to touch this heel, but we do want to see if our toe is the correct length or not. So this is our little guide that we're going to use, okay? And we go down to where the hard horn starts, and we measure this distance here. And so you can see we would have to take a little bit off of this toe in order to meet this guideline here. So that's a little bit difficult to do with my nippers right now, so I'm just going to use a grinder and see if this works. But we're going to try not to touch the back of the claw right here when we're trimming. All right, so I'm just going to mute my mic for a minute so I don't block. Okay, so what I've done is I've cut it to the approximately correct length here. Okay, so measuring from the hard horn, I measure down there, and again, it's a little bit difficult to see in the video here, but we've got it at about the right length here. Okay, so that's the first step. And then I'm also trying to make this as flat as I can, side or front to back. Oops, sorry. So front to back, we're trying to get that as flat as we can. All right. Then I also want it to be flat this way. All right, so that's what I'm trying to achieve with my trimming at this point. You can see, incidentally, here, where's my little pointer go? Okay, so you can see here that we have evidence of lesions in the white line. And so right here, again, you can see some hemorrhage in the white line, but again, this is not causing a problem currently, although it is potentially a place that an infection could get in there. Again, you can see I can stick this probe in there very easily. Okay, so that's what we're trying to achieve. And then what we would end up doing is we're going to try and make this claw here, match this one. Okay, I didn't touch the heel back here when I was trimming, but what I'm going to do now is if I hold these front hoof walls together, you can see I'll have to take a little bit off the sole here, and I'm going to have to take some off the heel of this claw here because I need these to be balanced across the back. So once again, I'll just shut off my microphone for a few seconds. Okay, so I'm not quite there yet probably, but you can see what we're trying to achieve then is that we're flat this way. We're flat across the heels, so now I'm making contact with both heels with this, and we're flat front to back. Right, so that's what we're trying to achieve with our trimming technique. Now, again, we'll see we've got some more evidence of choritis here, or laminitis, that we've got some separation here in the white line. You can maybe see that. That doesn't look quite healthy. There's a little bit of hemorrhage here in the bottom of the sole. Those, again, fairly typical things that you'll see in cows. So let's have a look at a couple quick things just to wrap this up. So if we do this properly, okay, we should have approximately 45 to 50 degree angle there. So I didn't do this ahead of time, but you can see we achieved pretty much a perfect angle on that foot. We follow those guidelines. Remember, I didn't take anything off the heel here. And so again, we're a little bit out on this one, but that's probably because I got them screwed together. Let's take them apart and have a quick look. All right, so what you'll see here is that we've got fairly normal looking sole. Okay. It's a little bit thinner at the front than it is at the back here. Okay, but we had the proper angle on there, so I'm not too worried about that. Probably could have taken off slightly more right here, but basically we've got a pretty good looking sole here. You can see we have a pretty good fat pad there, but we are pretty thin right here at the very back. Right, so again, the hoof wall would have protected that, but it's not too bad if we don't have any weight bearing on this area, because this is where the sole ulcer is most likely to occur. So again, I don't have time to show you the rest of our trimming technique, but we would have taken some of the sole away from here anyway. If we look on the other claw, again, you can see fairly normal sole thickness all the way across here. Okay, so that's fairly normal, but we do have some evidence of hemorrhage here. And this was probably 2 to 3 weeks ago, because there's some normal looking sole tissue right here above this, if you will. And so again, we've got a defect here in the sole over the typical sole ulcer site, which is not a good thing. But with our normal trimming technique, we would have taken away some of this area right here, which would have helped prevent some future problems there. So, all right, so that's kind of a really quick look at the trimming technique that we would be using. Okay. All right, so let's go back to finish up here. All right, so again, this is what we're trying to achieve. And then again, just to kind of wrap things up here, and if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. I know we're past our hour, but so again, we need to think when we're talking about lameness of preventing, identifying, and managing lameness. We need to think when we're putting together a hoof health program of the cow factors, the environmental factors, and the people factors. And then kind of the bottom line here is we always need to be nice to the corium, because the corium is an extremely important tissue that we need to keep healthy and happy. So, all right, any questions there? Okay, well, this was recorded, so it should be available to you. And again, I'm more than happy to take any questions by email later. Let's see. Oh, we do have a couple here. Okay, I'm sorry, I missed them. They didn't show up on my other laptop. So, question: does lying down increase blood flow to the hoof tissue? So it probably doesn't change the blood flow a whole lot, unless obviously we have excessive pressure on that foot, right? So if we have excessive pressure, we can have a decrease in blood flow to parts of that foot, which is how we end up getting that damage. So yes, it will probably increase the perfusion of the whole corium. Again, if the foot is healthy and it's on a normal walking surface and it's flat and all that kind of stuff, it probably won't make a huge change. But we will have some areas where we have excessive pressure, then yes, it will make a difference. What's your opinion on the use of hoof hardness measure to assess hoof sole quality? I have not used those myself, but I think there certainly is some validity to that. I would be interested in seeing some research on that. But again, if we can make a healthier hoof to start with, it's probably able to withstand some of the environments that it lives in. Again, I've not seen research to prove this. We also want to be careful that we don't completely dry out our foot, if you will, and end up with a really hard sole. So sometimes cows that are in tie stalls have really dry feet, and you probably have a slightly harder hoof hardness measure on those. I'm not sure that's going to be necessarily a good thing in all cases either. So, all right, I think that was all the questions that I had. So if there's no more questions, then I guess we will sign off here in a few minutes. So once again, thank you for participating.